Chelsea's 2-1 defeat to Brighton in the FA Cup was undoubtedly a frustrating match for the Stamford Bridge side, but it was an interesting game from the neutrals' point of view because it was a game in which Enzo Maresca was forced to confront the frustrations he's had with that attacking lineup over the course of this season. It was perhaps quite fitting that the only goal for Chelsea on the day came from Cole Palmer pulling a goal out of thin air, while that Chelsea front line of Palmer, Christopher Nkunku and Jadon Sancho more or less did nothing over the course of the match, only for Maresca to then come out after the game and more or less state that, this underlined why the club missed Nicolas Jackson. That itself was quite an intriguing thing for Maresca to say after the match, considering that Jackson, who missed the game through injury, hasn't actually scored in the Premier League for Chelsea since the 2-1 win over Brentford in mid-December. Knowing Nkunku probably isn't the ideal replacement for Jackson, but I think this predicament that Chelsea are in right now is one that was kind of born out of the club's really bizarre transfer policy since the new owners came in 2022. And we're maybe beginning to see the real kind of consequences of what has been a really confusing and baffling, to be perfectly honest with you, transfer policy. And this front line maybe sums it up better than any other part of the team right now. For example, when we take a look at every forward or attacking midfielder that Chelsea have signed since Todd Boehly and co. obviously took over ownership of the club, we can see that they've spent just south of €670 million on new players. Now, the problem that Chelsea are in right now, and the reason that Maresca looks like such a frustrated head coach this season, is the fact that the vast majority of them simply haven't worked out. As we can see when we take a look at that list, there are a number of big-name players who joined the club for a lot of money who more or less haven't done a huge amount in a Chelsea shirt since then. There are some obvious names on that list who obviously didn't live up to the billing. Raheem Sterling joined for €56 million and has since left to join Arsenal on loan. Hal Felix equally joined for a combined $63 million, which includes the loan fee from the previous season, and obviously left in January to go on loan to another club. Mikhail Mudryk, who for obvious reasons isn't playing for Chelsea right now. But there are other ones as well. For example, Christopher Nkunku's there as well, Kieran Dewsbury-Hall, and you could probably also include Enzo Fernandez in that, who in my personal opinion hasn't really lived up to the billing as a €121 million playmaker for Chelsea. In fact, when we take a look at the amount of money spent on all these forward or attacking players and the amount of goals, assists and appearances they all made, we can actually see that very few of them have actually hit the mark. So much so that Cole Palmer and Nicolas Jackson are perhaps the only bona fide successes on this list, to such an extent that between the two of them, they've scored 65 of the 159 goals scored between those players, which is 41% of the goals. They've assisted 32 of the 93, which is 34% of the goals. And when we combine that as goal contributions, i.e. goals and assists, Palmer and Nicolas Jackson have accounted for 38% all the goals and assists scored or created by every player on this list, which is a pretty remarkable sum considering that their transfer fees only cost 13% with total spent on forward or attacking players under the Chelsea's new owners. Now, Chelsea obviously deserve a huge amount of credit for scouting and finding both Palmer and Nicolas Jackson, who were relatively unknown quantities before they made the move to Stamford Bridge and have since become bona fide Premier League stars. But that list of players does kind of hint at a transfer strategy that doesn't really have any inherent pattern to it or any long-term goal either. There are a number of young players on that list who could still become top players for Chelsea. David Washington could do well and become a first-team player. Maybe even David Datro Fofana could go on to become a star for Chelsea. And of course, Palmer and Jackson are still at the very start of their careers. But over the course of every season under these new owners, the club have gone out and spent money on big name signings that haven't really worked out, and they've come across as rather blunt approaches to the transfer market, where Chelsea previously used to be known for very smart long-term thinking. Most Chelsea fans don't need me to remind them of the players that come to mind when we talk about such transfers. We could talk about obviously Raheem Sterling joining the club from Manchester City unexpectedly, Aubameyang joining as well, even Christopher Nkunku to a large extent has joined Chelsea and very rarely actually played in the position or role he was such a success for at RB Leipzig for a number of years. And then you can even go further down the list to this season alone, where Pedro Neto was signed on a relatively last-minute deal, while Felix, his transfer came out of nowhere And of course, Kieran Dewsbury-Hall was joined more or less, as far as we can tell, only because he did well for Maresca at Leicester City. But perhaps the most obvious example of this short-term or reactionary approach to the transfer market is Jadon Sancho, who joined the club on loan. But by the time the end of the season comes, Chelsea will end up paying about €30 million for his services. Now, Sancho could develop into a top Premier League player at Chelsea, and he certainly has had his moments under Maresca this season. But we're still talking about a player here who's bagged 2 goals and 6 assists in just 21 appearances this season. And rather than being a solution to Maresca's attacking problems, he feels like the only option that the Chelsea manager has to play. And so it doesn't feel as though Chelsea have actually thought out their transfer policy and carefully planned this squad out for Maresca's delight. But instead, the Chelsea manager has been forced to use players from here and there that were signed with no real long-term or overarching strategy in place from the start. But hey, Chelsea still have a very young squad. They are in the middle of a transition season with a new head coach, and despite all that, they're still 4th in the Premier League table. So I'm more than willing to give Maresca and a number of these players the benefit of the doubt, considering that many of them are still at the start of their career. But the thing that worries me about Chelsea isn't so much what's happening on the pitch, but what has been happening off it for the last couple of years. And while many clubs around them in the Premier League do have these long-term visions and overarching transfer policies that keep them ahead, it feels as though the Chelsea owners have been very reactionary from one transfer window to the next. And this team and Maresca's attacking lineup in particular are paying the cost for it this season.